You haven't heard, Nelda King passed away. I think this morning. So let's remember the family in our prayers. We may not always think this way, but for the individual who's faithful to the Lord, it's good. It's good for her. Huh? Yeah, this morning. So just remember them. We'll find out in the near future when the funeral will be and everything like that. Just remember the family in our prayers. I appreciate Brother Elward's prayer as far as the Bible class, because two of the closest people that I work with, one is an elder, the other is the church secretary, already talking amongst themselves how they had a 45-minute nap coming up. And I'm thinking, will it be that long? But I know they were just teasing. I'm very thankful to be asked by the elders here to teach 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and the book of Titus. So that will take us through at least the next 3 years. No. Michael would be fine with that. I remember the first class I ever taught, the first work was on Genesis, and I taught Genesis for 2 years. And that was probably just skimming the surface as well. No, I never finished Proverbs, but someone else didn't finish Isaiah. We're going to be honest. No, I had to leave. We did get to Proverbs 19. I remember that. But very thankful for this. It's a great opportunity. We're not going to begin, of course, with 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 1. I think it would be a disservice to do that. We're going to begin with an introduction to 1 Timothy. And when you give an introduction to 1 Timothy, you're also going to include from time to time 2 Timothy and Titus. I found it interesting doing some more research on this chapter, this book, that a number of commentators basically, when they give the introduction to begin 1 Timothy, they give an introduction to 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus at the same time. So when they do get to 2 Timothy, there really isn't much of an introduction, or Titus, much of an introduction, but they go together so much. When you go to a school of preaching, and specifically the first year, you have a number of manuscripts that they require of you to put together. What I did not understand at the time, because the first year it was on the books of the New Testament. I think the first book was John that you had to give an introduction to. And then there was another book, and then another book, all in 1 year. And I thought, why are they having us do an introduction to these books? Why not a certain topic? But the more you do it, the more you realize the reason for doing that. Guess what that reason is? Any ideas? If you have even a fairly thorough of a book in the introduction to begin with, you already have a good sense of what that book is about. You know what they're going to teach in the introduction. It's kind of like when you come to Bible class and you study over those verses before you come to Bible class. You're going to enjoy that class even more because you already have a general introduction to those verses. So that's what we're going to start with this morning. And hopefully there will be some material left over for next Sunday. And then we will continue on into 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 1. With any introduction to a book, this is going to be hard to believe, you are going to find disagreements galore. You find them with scholars of the Bible. And I ain't a scholar, but I like to think I'm a student. This man over here is much more of a scholar than I am. You didn't have to agree with that. It is true. But you're going to have disagreements in a number of areas. We can agree to disagree as long as it's not contradicting what the Bible is teaching to begin with. Because when you come to things like a date, and Michael's brought this up in the past, good luck. Can we come to the exact date of anything in the Scriptures? I'll let you answer that question because I can't. But we can come to a close proximity of what that date was. So a number of disagreements. I was taught by Brother Keith Mosier, and Brother Mosier, I would say, it was a biblical scholar. And he mentioned, because he taught the book of Revelation, he stated that you can have 20 commentaries on the book of Revelation, and there will come a certain point or a certain matter where every single commentary, all 20, will disagree with one another. So we have to understand that. But it's a good idea to read all those 20 commentaries and look what they have to say. But a number of ways there are disagreements. As I mentioned, the dates that are given. Sometimes there's a disagreement with when that book was written, to whom it was written, who wrote the book to begin with. I believe it was last Sunday morning in Bible class, there's disagreements over who wrote Hebrews, because it doesn't come out and tell us. Well, we know who wrote it, who was the author, and that's God. But as far as the human author, we don't know. I have come to believe that according to the style of writing of Paul and other epistles, I believe it was Paul. That's just my opinion. That and a buck probably won't even get you a cup of coffee at McDonald's anymore. But that's just my opinion. Now, I won't be dogmatic about it. My father believed that it was not Paul, and he was pretty dogmatic about that. But the reason he believed that was because Bill Klein believed it wasn't Paul. And sometimes we think along those things. We think of a preacher, an elder, very knowledgeable, and with, okay, I'll just accept that. So we can agree to disagree with those things.
Who's Bill Klein think about it? Apollos?
What's that?
Who's Bill Klein think about it?
I don't know. You'd have to talk to him about that.
I can't.
No, not yet. You still live right, and you will.
Yes, sir.
We still live right. We'll be able to ask Paul or Peter or Moses, why did you do this? I can't hear you.
Job.
Job? Oh, Job. Yeah. But we were talking also about, just mentioned it. Did Moses write the last chapter in Deuteronomy? We know that he wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. We know pretty much the dates. But there are brethren who believe there's no way he wrote that because he would have written about his own death. So who wrote it? Good luck with that. I remember being taught that a lot of people believed it was Joshua. Others have taught, well, it was one of the other prophets that would come later. Here's another thing to think about. Why couldn't he have written it? This is what I was also taught in school. If you think about it, there is no reason why Moses couldn't have written about his own death. Wouldn't have changed anything. But sometimes we as brethren just like to argue. We like to think about, well, what if or what if that, and that happens. Nothing wrong with that, as long as we don't get upset or become too dogmatic about it. Our way is the only way. Many scholars believe that 1 Timothy and Titus go together. Almost everyone agrees with that. And pretty much everyone agrees that 2 Timothy, of course, was written last. And really, 1 Timothy and Titus go together. But 2 Timothy is like separate of those two. What was 2 Timothy about?
He was a prisoner in Rome.
In Rome. You know that prison still exists today?
Number town prison.
Yeah. It's more or less a museum today. And they will even state, this is the cell where the Apostle Paul was before he was executed. Now, was that his cell, or are they just trying to make money from that? Well, who knows? Most of these, let me rephrase that. These three books are without a doubt God's Word. Without a doubt, they belong in the Bible. Without a doubt, they are what is sometimes referred to as the canon of the Scriptures. You know what that means? What is the canon of the Scriptures?
Rule.
A rule. Well, if you want some more detail, you will have to come back this afternoon, because that's this afternoon's sermon, and we're going to talk about this. We know how we got the Word of God. But how did we get the Bible? The 66 books, which is a good study. You all have a marvelous, wonderful library back there. Sadly, most folks don't ever use it. I'm in there all the time stealing books. I just asked the secretary. Not for the preacher. Everybody else has to. Yes. But they are returned. And they generally go from there to my office and then back again. I'm not going to be checking out 10 books in one day. But there's one book that is titled General Introduction to the New Testament, to the Bible. It's a good book. It's a thorough book. It was a class that we were taught, and they wouldn't teach it until the second grade. Brother Mosier, second year, Brother Mosier taught it, and it's because you guys aren't ready for it that first year, because you had a lot of, late teens, early 20-year-old boys, and that's what they were. But it tells you how they were able to discover what God had already labeled as His Word. But it's a good book. And the reason why God chose the Hebrew, why He chose the Aramaic, and why He chose the Greek. That was one of my manuscripts that I had to write. But it's an interesting study. And all that does is build our faith to know that the Bible is these 66 books. That's it. No new revelations. Now, the denominational world have for hundreds of years referred to 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus as the pastoral epistles. Is that correct, or is that a misnomer? Pastoral? Well, not talking about a pasture. So what are they thinking of? Why do they refer to it as? Denominational pastors. By the way, any questions, any comments, any disagreements, just, raise your hand. Or just speak out. But that's how they refer to it as. Basically, since 1726, this man's name was Paul Anton. He coined that phrase for 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus as the pastoral epistles. And it is misleading. It's interesting, though, when a gospel preacher will even refer to it as that, without pointing out why it's not pastoral epistles. You can think of it as evangelist epistles. Was Titus, was Timothy, were they elders? I'm getting this, and I'm also...
Ever hearing them call that by anybody that we were talking about?
Do you find it in the Bible that they were elders?
No.
You don't. You find them as being preachers, evangelists.
I figured they thought maybe because they got the qualifications of a pastor in there, or elder. That's the only way I would look at it.
Yeah, I guess that could be. These three books were not written to pastors of a congregation. They just weren't. They were written to preachers. Young evangelists, Timothy and Titus, but we understand that pastors, the denominations have for hundreds of years referred to their preachers as a pastor. And they used it in the singular. One man over the whole congregation. Some of them have deacons underneath that one pastor, and then the members. But one man rule, basically. Is this taught in the New Testament? It is not taught in the New Testament. They started getting away from the truth in that 2nd century. Somewhere around 150 AD, they started to go to one-man rule. They thought that that was going to keep the church protected from false teachers. They thought their way was better than God's way. But of course, we know this is foreign to the teachings of the New Testament. Pastors in the New Testament, as we all know, we have 3 here, also referred to as shepherds, elders, bishops. Again, plural, which means you have to have at least 2. And as my dad used to say, if you have an odd number, there's a tiebreaker. Sometimes you need those. Someone read for me, for all of us, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, and then someone also look up Acts 20, verse 17. You see a distinction made between evangelists and pastors, elders? There's a distinction. Brother Hatcher for a number of years was a pastor and a preacher. But he wasn't a pastor because he was a preacher. He was a pastor because of the qualifications. 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1. And he had the will. He had the desire. And that's key as well. You can have qualifications, but if you don't desire the work, well, you shouldn't be one. Acts 20, verse 17, please. Elders of the church. Called them from Miletus to come down, and he was going to address them before making his trip on to Jerusalem, and set down in stone what they were to do to feed the church of God, to watch out for false teachers. And he stated that he knew they would creep in, and guess what? They crept in. One of the slogans from the Restoration period in this country back in the late 17 and through most of the 1800s was, we are to speak what the Bible speaks, call things by Bible names instead of, for example, denominational names. But most of folks who are in the denominational world, they find out that you may refer to yourself as a preacher. Oh, you're a pastor. Happens all the time. And you correct them. And they'll want to know, well, what's the difference? And you go to the Bible, which they do not go to point these things out. Any questions? Any comments? Pastors, a plurality, bishops, elders, New Testament church, Timothy and Titus are not described as that. They are referred to as preachers, preachers of the Word of God. Remember, Timothy had been given the charge to what? 2 Timothy 4:2. Preach the Word. Later, to do the work of an evangelist in verse 5. Here's another thing to think about. Brother H. Leo Bowles, I read, he would read 1 and 2 Timothy every single week. That's 52 weeks in a year. And he did it for 50 years. Well, you do the math. 2,650 or something like that. Do you think he knew that book, those two books, by heart? He probably had it memorized to some degree, or have a ready recollection of what a certain passage was saying. If someone asked him, he could probably recall it easily. These are written to help, even today, preachers to do their work. Do you have to be a preacher to read and study and apply these books to your life? No, you do not. You do not. But it's good to be a student of the Word. It's important to be a student of the Word. It's imperative to be a student of the Word. God, you could say, requires us to be students of the Word. One of the reasons why the church has drifted in the last 40, 50 years is because people are not students of the Word. So you can refer to these three books as evangelistic epistles. Yeah.
Clergy or pastors, if you have a question, you go ask me.
Yeah.
Don't read it for yourself, just go ask me.
Yeah. I had a discussion with one of the women at Wally World yesterday. Some little boy was throwing a fit, and I looked at her and says, it's the end of the world for him. Whatever he's not getting, this life is over. And she agreed, it is the end of the world. But she was looking at another kind of a doctrine. That is, I think it's in every denomination, in one form or another, premillennialism. So we discussed a few things, and then another lady joined us. But I was mentioning some of the points where she was wrong. She had never heard that in her life. And she made the comment, I've always been taught. She never studied for herself. She didn't find out for herself. She just accepted what her pastor taught her as the truth. And that's what they do. We don't do that in any other area except religion. We like to have a second opinion from our doctors or something like this, what medication we should take or not take, and on down the road. But when it comes to religion, somehow it's just not as important. But it is.
It only means they're hearing what they want to hear.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's what they usually do.
Yeah. And if they don't hear it there, they'll go somewhere else where they can hear it. Timothy is first mentioned in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. His mother was a Jewess, but his father was Greek. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, we learn her name was Lois, which means her grandmother's name was Eunice or Eunice. We were discussing that this morning before class. However you want to say it. We know who you're talking about. Now, both of these women, Jews, were faithful Christians as well, and raised him correctly with that unfeigned faith. I sometimes like to phrase it as unpretended faith. More correct rendering is genuine faith, and that's what he had. Where did he get it? He got it from his parents, and it's something even Paul realized. And it is believed that Paul converted Timothy. It's believed that Paul converted Timothy on that first missionary journey when Paul and Barnabas were in Lystra. Acts chapter 14, 6 through 23 addresses this. That area was, I believe, Iconium. This is now in modern-day Turkey. But like Galatia, it was a certain area. Could be vast, could be small, where these cities were located, like Lystra and Derbe. Now, on his second missionary journey, Paul took seemingly a strong liking to him, and you don't have to read a commentary to understand this. You can read your Bible, and that'll point it out as well. I used class notes. I used a number of commentaries. I used lectureship books. I'll go to bulletins that brethren have written over the years. There's a lot of information on the internet. You can use Bible programs on your computer, but you know what works more than anything? This right here. This is right. Even commentaries and lectures by faithful brethren have sometimes got it wrong. But the Bible doesn't. Would someone turn to Acts chapter 16 and read verses 1 through 3 for us? This is his second missionary journey. Him and who else was with him? Silas.
Then came he to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek, which was well reported of by the brethren that were in Lystra and Iconium. Him would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they knew all that his father was a Greek.
Thank you, sir. What does verse 2 mention again? It says, well reported. Timothy was well reported of by the brethren in that area. For what? Being a faithful child of God. So they knew of him that way. But Paul circumcised him for expediency's sake, knowing the attitude of the Jews. Now, Timothy would accompany Paul on a number of the journeys with him, but he wasn't always with Paul. Sometimes he would be left behind at Ephesus. And there he would be teaching Jew and Gentiles, and sometimes he would go into the synagogues, and guess what? If he was uncircumcised, there would be a problem. Or at least that's what Paul thought. So he had him circumcised for expediency's sake. Why did Paul not have Titus circumcised? We're getting ahead of ourselves, but that's okay.
How would they know if someone was circumcised?
That's a very good idea. And a very good question. So for next Sunday morning, you do some research on this and you let us know. If a person was a Jew, you would naturally expect them to be circumcised, would you not? You would. That was their law. For how many years? This is a...
About 2,000 years.
Well, law of Moses was around for 1,500.
Do we have bathhouses back then?
Who?
We have bathhouses.
What does that have to do with the lesson at all? We're not going to... Good. But yes, they did. They weren't completely animals like we are today. Now, if you are a Greek, a Gentile, would you be circumcised? No, you wouldn't. No one would think that you were. Now, people are who are not Jew, but I guarantee you those who are the Jewish faith, they're circumcised. They may eat bacon, which is against their law, but they don't follow their law anymore. They don't follow the law of Moses. They can't follow the law of Moses. And we know the obvious reasons for this. So, back to the question. Why did not Paul have Titus circumcised?
Well, Galatians 5:4.
You can let other people speak up.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Anybody besides Dale, then we'll come back to Dale.
He was teaching the fact that you don't have to be circumcised.
Yeah.
He was an example.
Yeah,
You don't have to be circumcised to be a Christian.
exactly. Okay, Dale?
Galatians 5:4 says, you're circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, he's a debtor due to the entire law, whole law.
Okay. But you realize most people don't know what that says.
Yeah,
And most people didn't at that time either.
yeah.
But more to the point what Brother Brantley was saying. He didn't have to be circumcised. He was a Gentile. He didn't have a Jewish mother or father and a Gentile mother or father. He was completely Greek. This is addressed, you remember, in Acts chapter 15. You think about that time, there were Judaizing teachers who had come up, and they were where Paul and Barnabas was at, and they were trying to tell people that you had to be to become a Christian, if you were a Gentile, you had to obey the law of Moses. You had to be circumcised as well. And this caused a huge problem. The term is brouhaha. So they were sent to Jerusalem to discuss this matter. And it was discussed. We know what it says. If you don't, read that chapter. And they came with the correct answer for that, which was God's answer, that the Gentiles did not have to be circumcised, that the elders there, the apostles, never did send out a message that that was to be done. How important was this to, as the saying goes, nip it in the bud? It was huge. You think of the impact that it would have had on this brand new religion. Now, Paul and Barnabas had just come back from that first missionary journey. And if they had left with instructions, and of course it wouldn't, but what if? If they had received instructions that the Gentiles had to obey the law of Moses, that they had to be circumcised, which they had not taught, Paul and Barnabas would have had to go back to all of those cities and those towns that they had brought to Christ, Gentiles, and tell them, we were wrong. We left something out. You have to obey the law of Moses as well. You have to be circumcised. Can you imagine the problems that that would have caused? Just knowing how Gentiles think, because we're all here Gentiles as far as I know, some of them would have said, nope, not going to do it. But that was not in the teachings of Christ. That was man. Isn't it wonderful that things like that do not happen today? Still, well, you're talking, I haven't got hardly anywhere. We may be in the introduction for a month. Well, we'll try to hurry it along.
They had to be taught that that was a covenant between Abraham and God.
Yes.
Not between the Christians.
That's right. It didn't apply to especially the Gentiles. Really, it didn't apply to the Jews either. Not anymore. Not the law. It was over. It was finished. How many laws do you see in place at the same time? What is Pensacola called? 5 flags. What does that mean? Okay, you had the Spanish, you had the French, you had the Confederates, you had the British before that, and you had the U.S. When one of those countries were ruling, you obeyed their law. The law of Moses in effect for the Jews, you obeyed that law. Gentiles didn't have to obey. The law of Moses wasn't given to the Gentiles to begin with. And we're kind of off topic, but it's not my fault. But, a lot of people, well, what law was the Gentiles under? What law were they under before the law of Moses came into effect? Patriarchal. That probably would have continued on until the law of Moses. It's interesting when you talk to, he was the first Christian, and he was white. They're wrong in both counts. He was a Jew. He lived under the law of Moses, but people don't do a whole lot of studying for themselves anymore. And that's a shame. That's why you have a mess. So he was circumcised for expediency. Henry Halley, in Halley's Bible Handbook, that's a good book to have also. I mean, it's right to the point, not exhaustive or anything like that, but it generally has the answers you're looking for. Halley mentions Timothy's character, and it kind of gives me hope as well. Sometimes it's hard to get up and to preach or to teach, and you're kind of timid to begin with, or you're shy. You have to really desire to do it. And you may not think that I'm shy, but I is. And every morning when I get up on Sunday morning, I know what I've got to do, and I'm nervous about it all. But he said he was timid and retiring by nature, was not in the best of health. You remember Paul, 1 Timothy 5:23 wrote, "Drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine often infirmities." So timid, shy, health problems to some degree or another, and if you were drinking the water back in those days, you were going to have stomach problems. That's why they added a mixture of the wine. But Halley goes on to state, he mentions that Timothy and Luke were Paul's most constant companions in his missionary journeys, and that Paul loved him devotedly. And Halley mentioned that Paul, in one way or the other, was lonesome without him. This is a close bond that they had with one another. And it was Timothy that Paul seemed to care for more than any of the others, any of the other disciples, including the apostles. Very close to this young man. I've often thought if Paul had a physical son, he would have wanted Timothy to be like him. I think he definitely was his son in the faith. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2, as we will notice, he called Timothy my own son in the faith. He also referred to him as son Timothy in verse 18 of that chapter. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2, he referred to him as my dearly beloved son. And in 1 Corinthians 4:17, he refers to Timothy as my beloved son. So, dear, very compassionate, and both had this for each other. One of the commentators stated that if it was up to Timothy, he never would have left Paul's side. He always would have been with him, but that was not to be. And you think about the Apostle Paul, did he lay a lot on Timothy and Titus's shoulders? Oh, absolutely he did. So how could someone be so timid, so reserved, and still do this? He was able to overcome it. It didn't hold him back. Halley in his book also records the work Timothy was involved in. And just a snippet of this. Accompanying Paul from city to city numerous times. At times he was left behind in a certain town, like Ephesus, 1 Timothy, to continue the work there. Paul went on to the next location. Other times Paul he was sent by Paul to build up a congregation that they had started years before, to build them up, to strengthen them. So Timothy was sent back to do that. Different congregations. So Timothy was not always with Paul, but he was always with Paul as far as thinking the same way. Always being faithful, he was faithful to Paul, he was faithful to God, as Paul was faithful. Did it really? I didn't hear that. Must be my bad ear. I'll have to keep. Well,
Timothy might have been sent to other places besides Ephesus.
Oh, yes.
Tell us everything.
Yeah, that's why I said this is just a snippet of what all the different places he worked. All right, thank you for the comments and everything, and Lord willing, we'll possibly finish the introduction next week.